Hello and welcome back, adventurers. This is Captain TTRPG, and today we're talking about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Welcome back, adventurers. Today we're going to do something a little different, something mostly unscripted, and something you already read the title so you know where I'm going. We're going to talk about a problem that I think Pathfinder has, a problem with classes. What do I mean by that? Do I mean I think they've made terrible classes, or they're making bad classes, or classes are not interesting? No, none of that. Don't worry about that. I love the classes. In fact, I love talking about the classes. It's why I made this channel. The classes I think are very interesting. But that doesn't mean that I think everything about the classes or the direction they're going with classes is perfect. No, actually, there's a couple different things I want to talk about in this video. First of those is, well, the new classes, they don't really mesh that well with your core classes for the game. Don't worry, we'll get into that. And the second is the question, are there too many classes now? Are they making too many classes? I'm sure there's going to be a lot of opinions on both of these topics. Maybe some that people actually even put in the comments. Who knows? But I'm going to give mine, and if you're still watching, I'm going to guess you do care what I have to say, or at least you're interested enough that you want to yell at me later. Either way works for me. I'm happy to be told that I'm wrong. So what do I mean by the new classes don't mesh with the core classes? For this, I'm going to say that the new classes are everything starting with the kineticist. And I say that because the kineticist seems to have been designed with the remaster in mind. And that's where I think they've really taken this in a different direction. The kineticist is a really interesting class. It's not only thematically very fun, and I think a lot of people were looking for this out of their games because a lot of people come from D&D 5e, and D&D 5e has no great way to do this. No, the Warrior of Elements monk doesn't count. The kineticist hits a very specific fantasy, something that a lot of people, I think, love quite a bit with your elemental abilities, and let's be honest, Avatar. People love Avatar. They want to play, Aang or whomever else. So it was made for good reasons with good intention, and I think it's a really interesting class. So many choices, so many ways to build it. Too many ways, some might say. In fact, it's one of the most complex classes to build a character for. And this is a trend we're starting to see more and more. Just look at level 1. Choices alone, you're going to choose a class feat like many martials do. And again, this is kind of a martial, kind of not. It lives in a weird in-between space. You're going to choose, well, before you can even choose what I'm going to call a subclass or what element, you have to choose you're doing 1 or 2 elements at the beginning. If you choose only 1 element, you're going to get a passive buff to what you get to do whenever you use your impulses, which now you have to keep in mind because it's not going to be tracked easily or well in a lot of ways. So now you have to keep that buff in mind, but it only affects the element that you're taking at first. So if you get another one later, it won't affect that one. Or if you take 2, you don't get that buff. And this also affects the number of feats you get. Then you have to think about what type of feats you're getting because some of them have overflow, and then you have to keep in mind that every time you overflow, it affects if you have an aura going, that going down, and you aren't controlling your element anymore, and then you have to spend a feat or an action tax next round to pay for the fact that you used an overflow and lost your element to get it back up and going, but you can do something, blast while you do that. There is just a lot to keep track of. So you've made a class that's challenging to build for many newer players or even semi-experienced players, I'd say, and that is extremely taxing to play. Not hard to play. Right? It's not difficult to say, oh, I'm going to do an elemental blast and a 2-action impulse this turn. Great, that wasn't that hard a choice. But there's a lot of little things to keep track of to make sure you're keeping buffs going or you still have everything active that you think you did. Your element is still working with you. You have more than just a simple set of what actions do I want to do this round. It's what do I have to keep track of to make sure I'm playing both correctly and even more so, for those who care, optimally. I'm not that kind of person. I don't worry about being optimal. I think it's fun not to be in a lot of ways, but some people really do care. And let's take this versus, because it lives in both martial and kind of caster realms, let's look at it compared to a martial. Okay, so maybe on my first turn as a kineticist, I might, if I don't have my element running, I might bring my element up and do a single action blast, and then, 2 action, do some other impulse. Perhaps I'm fire, and I send a little flying bird there to do a d8 of damage to 2 characters. Great, I did 5 damage to a couple enemies. I got my aura going, I sent a blast out, maybe hit somebody for a few damage there. Not a ton, but a little bit. I did some interesting stuff. It's not bad. And I affected multiple targets. And next turn, maybe I can do a 3-action overflow impulse, or I could move, get up to somebody, do a melee 2-action elemental blast. Some options there. And I like options. Keep in mind, I'm going to have a lot more options than a standard martial might have at level 1. And let's look at a barbarian. Let's say I'm playing a dragon barbarian. Okay, so I turned on my raids for free. Thank you, Remaster. It's my first turn. Well, for 2 actions, I can clear across the entire battlefield and hit my enemy. That's all for 2 actions, and I don't even need to crit. I might just do 14 damage. With my strength buff and my die size on my weapon and my rage damage bonus, I'm going to hit pretty hard. I might take a creature out. Maybe there was another one right next to me. I hit that one. Maybe I take it out too. Maybe I don't. Maybe I just go and take an action to go flank with an ally. But suddenly that turn I took as a barbarian, I can do enough damage that I take something out. It was very easy for me to plan out what I was going to do because my options are fairly limited, but I still feel effective on the battlefield, and it didn't take a lot of setup. I have nothing to keep track of other than, am I still in a rage? I am? Hooray! That's pretty much what I got to keep track of. Whereas the kineticist has a lot more to keep track of. In my mind, that makes the kineticist far more interesting a class than the barbarian, but I look for that kind of complexity, and I have to want that complexity to take it. Now let's look at it against a spellcaster. And I think a good example here, let's take the druid. Okay, the druid has cantrips, a focus spell, and some spell slots with spells at first level that they can use. Great. So as a druid on my first turn, I'm going to choose maybe a 2-action spell to cast, and maybe I move. Maybe I'm an animal druid and I command my animal and cast, I don't know, a 2-action heal. I'm still making choices, but the only thing I have to keep track of, and I went the complex case because I've got my animal companion, is my animal companion and marking off a spell slot. That's really not that hard. I'm not going to lose any buff or gain any buff, or there's no number changing I have to worry about. It's just roll what I expect to roll, use my spell slot, great. If I went with some other type of druid, this would have been even easier. And spellcasters are usually the most complex characters. At least they were if you look at the core classes. So I'm not just trying to beat up on the kineticist here, because again, I actually think kineticist is very interesting. I'm a huge fan of druids and barbarians too, but I think from an interesting standpoint, definitely the kineticist comes out ahead. Well, let's look at the other newer classes. Let's look at the 2 that just came out, in fact. We've got the Animist, and we got the Exemplar. Okay, let's look at the Animist. Here's another spellcaster, and they've got their spirits. Lots of choices with the spirits, lots of possible interesting choices, and the subclasses for the Animist play very differently. And there's a whole ton of things to learn to be able to play this class. You have to understand how choosing your spirit affects what spells you have available to you. If you set up a way where you can swap spirits, you have to figure out how that's going to work. Your active and passives, and you've got your spell slots that act differently than a normal full spellcaster does. And the level of complexity in building, again, is really high, but also the complexity in combat, the things to keep track of, the things not to forget are extremely high here, which means you have to have somebody who's very dedicated to learning how to play that class correctly, is engaged with the GM who also has to know how to play that class really well, because there's going to be a lot of questions that come up. And that's just barriers to entry, barriers to play. And while I think that offers way more interesting options, and again, I'm going to compare to the druid here, an animist has far more interesting options of what to do turn to turn, how to build, than a druid does. But it's so much more complex that it's going to scare players away from the class. And I don't think that's great. And last one I'll talk about is the exemplar at length, and then I'll just quickly cover the others in the playtests. The exemplar is one that's not meant to be as complex, right? Here we have a martial class. You get to choose your icons up front. Great. The icons aren't always that challenging to understand. Some of them are pretty straightforward, get some nice passive bonuses. And then when you activate them with, Transcendence, usually pretty easy to understand how to use them. But you still have to understand that you have to spark Transcendence and that you can only do it once per turn, and that you can still move the spark if you want to outside of that, but that you have to move it when you spark Transcendence. And then if you're high enough leveled, you have to worry about your epithets. And did you follow that? Like, did you actually remember to do that when you spark Transcendence? And next turn, where's it going to be? And then you have to figure out what you're going to do with it after you get it out of that one, or if you're going to keep it in that one when you... Even that one, which is simpler, I think much easier to build than the other examples I've talked about. When you get into play, it's not as simple. I still find it far more interesting. I love the exemplar. I think it's probably the coolest martial that they've made. I do love some of the other ones too, like, partial martials like Inventor and stuff, but it is really an interesting class. But it's a lot for somebody to take in, and it's a lot to manage turn to turn. You can't even for a minute forget to keep track of something, or you're going to play entirely wrong, and you might catch it 3 rounds later and be disappointed in yourself. You're like, oh, I forgot about this buff, or I forgot that I had moved the spark here. All these things to keep track of that add a lot of challenge, a lot of fun complexity if that's what you're looking for, but it's just barrier to entry for the class. When you look at the other classes, the playtest classes, this is the same thing you'll see as you look at the Commander and, well, the Guardian maybe less so. Well, there's still some stuff like this in the Guardian too. But then we look at the most recent playtest, the Impossible playtest. You've got definitely this level of complexity, if not more, in the Runesmith and the Necromancer, where you're constantly dealing with resources and what's available to you and what you've already set up and what you have to trigger. So much complexity turn to turn, and some of them have huge build complexity. When you look back at those core classes, it just doesn't feel like they're part of the same game. Now, am I saying we shouldn't have these types of classes with this type of complexity? No, not at all. I think the bigger problem is that there was none built into those early core classes. Look at Fighter, look at Barbarian, look at some of your base spellcasters, look at Monks. There's so little complexity in those that you're kind of driving any new players and any players who just don't feel like they have the ability to keep track of all this stuff down to those core classes, and they're not allowed to kind of play in this area. Whereas if all of them had more things to manage, and that just was how the game was run, I think that would fit better. Or if these classes were part of disparate systems, that would also work better. I just don't think they play very well together. And I'm worried about that. I'm worried that it's going to keep players from picking up the new classes when they're so interesting. Saying that, in the 3 games I run, there's a kineticist in each of the games, but I don't see the players excited about the newer classes that are coming out, either the 2 that just came out or the playtest classes. And that worries me, because I think they're so very cool. This will dovetail right into my next concern, which is maybe Pathfinder2e just has too many classes. When I came over here from D&D 5e, I was very excited about the number of classes, because for anybody coming from that system, or who knows it, there's only 13 classes, 12 in the new version, since they haven't added Artificer back in yet. That doesn't give you a lot of choice. There's so much you want to build in fantasy for your characters that just doesn't fit in any of those buckets. So having more classes, having more options, that meant a lot to me. I thought, wow, I can really build characters the way that I want to build characters. So I went through and I read through all the classes when I got here, excited about every single one of them, thought they were so cool. There's things that I hadn't seen before as even character classes in other systems. And so I thought, great, this will really be so many options for my players, and they're going to find a lot of joy in this. And I quickly found that I went to go help them figure out what class they wanted to play. So I would walk through the classes and just give highlights. I wasn't going in detail. I went, Alchemist, this is the one if you want to make these types of items and be some support and do some damage and throwing bombs and things like that. And I went class by class, not making it too detailed, but just giving them ideas. And by the time I get to, 12, 13, 14, 15 classes in, they're done. They're overloaded. That's just too many options for my players. And I don't know that that's going to be true for everybody out there. And I had some players that went deep and looked at all of them, but it's just so many options that it was too many. It was an overload. And we just keep adding to that. I mean, you look at the most recent playtest, the Impossible playtest, if I'm counting correctly, that'll put us up to numbers 28 and 29. 25 classes right now, today, out in the game. And we have 4 more in playtests on their way. I love the variety. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing else like the Necromancer, or the Runesmith, or the Commander. Let's ignore the Guardian. That I do, in fact, want all of them, and I think they're all very cool. But I don't know that the game needs them anymore, or is aided by them being added. So you might think, all right, you don't want any more classes. Well, so you're trying to say that Pathfinder2e shouldn't have any more character customization options? And that's not what I'm saying at all. In fact, quite different from that. I think we lean into other aspects of character augmentation, creation, and customization that we haven't seen as much of. Now, we already do get a lot of archetypes, and adding more archetypes, still good, not upset. Every once in a while, we get new subclasses added to classes. Maybe we just lean into this a lot more. Maybe as books come out, they really give us interesting new subclasses for the classes we already have. That way people understand how the class plays, and they can just get excited about what the subclass offers. Maybe we even go further than that. Maybe we start adding in more base class feats when books come out. So you've suddenly got better customization options no matter which type of, pick your poison, barbarian you went with, or inventor you have, or kineticist. All of these options are different ways that we can still build out our characters, but we can use the ones that people understand, they've read about, they know how it's going to work. They don't have to every 9 months or a year think about, I have to learn 2 more classes if I want to be able to use the new stuff. Because that can be really overwhelming, and it suddenly just fades into white noise, honestly. And I don't want that to be the case. I want it to be exciting every single time. When the last 2 classes came out, the Animist and the Exemplar, I noticed an interesting trend, and this was brought up by some of my favorite YouTubers. It said it looked like interest just wasn't as high in looking at these new classes as they had expected. And I think that's got a lot to do with the fact that people are kind of burned out by the number we have. And they just want to be able to expand the classes that we already do have. And maybe I'm way off here. Maybe they just weren't into the Animist and the Exemplar. Maybe it's just the time of year it came out. It could have been anything. I could be way off here. This is just what I personally see and my thoughts on it. Anyway, I know that the opinions I've given here probably weren't your favorite to listen to, although if you got to this point, at least you're interested. I'd love to get your thoughts. Do you think there's a problem with the classes we have or that are coming out? Do you think that maybe we aren't even close, that we could just have more classes forever and the new design is the way to go? Sound off in the comments. I'd love to get your thoughts. I have a couple other topics like this I want to talk about. I'm certainly going to be covering the remaster and my thoughts on all of the remasterings they've done so far, but I'm waiting for Guns and Gears remaster to come out before I get there, so do expect something on that topic at the very least. But for now, I'm going to go put some more thoughts down on paper for some other videos I need to create, and as always, adventure on.